As of I'm Donald Bryson. I'm the president here at the John Locke Foundation, and thanks for the latest presentation of our Civitas poll, where we literally poll the pulse of what's going on with North Carolina's electorate to see what people's opinions are on not just the horse races in the upcoming elections, but also the issues of the day. We do have a few events coming up. First off, I do want to announce, obviously, we have a poll presentation today. We will also be releasing Civitas polls in September, October, and November to round out the year. So we'll have September and October as we get closer to the elections to see what's going on. And then in November, we'll do another poll to figure out what in the world just happened to us. So let's all be praying for the November poll and whatever that may be, and that we all live to see November. We do have another event coming up in August. It'll be on August, I want to get this right, August 30th at the Alamo Theater. Here in Raleigh, we'll be doing a screening of a film called The Hong Konger, which was produced by the Acton Institute. It tells the story of the Apple Daily, which was a pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong, and how it has been shut down by the pro-Chinese government there in Hong Kong. And so it will be really good. Tickets are on sale on the John Locke Foundation website. Go to johnlocke.org, click events. You can buy tickets there at the website. It should be a good event, but again, that's at 5:30 p.m. on August 30th here at the Alamo Theater in Raleigh. I'm pointing that way. Vaguely, the Alamo is in that direction, but not really. Anyway, we're now to the Civitas poll, our August poll, where we see what people think about the issues of the day and the political climate here in North Carolina since we are past the summer break. My kids started school this week. A lot of kids started school this week. We're back to school, and Labor Day is coming up, which is the official kickoff of campaign season. So we'll get going. We always have a guest commentator. Not always. We usually have a guest commentator. One of our regulars, and we're always happy to have, is Dr. Andrew Taylor. He's a professor of political science at North Carolina State University. He's a great friend of the John Locke Foundation. We're happy to have you here, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. Thanks.
Very good.
For having me.
If you'd like to tweet along at home or do Facebook commentary, we'd really appreciate it. This will be streaming live on Facebook as well as our YouTube channels. For those of you viewing at home, feel free to comment or ask questions. We'll go through the poll and then we'll take questions at the end, either from folks in the audience or at home. To go through the poll, just real quick, people always want to know about the methodology. It was conducted by Signal Polling. It was a survey sample size of 650 likely 2022 general election voters here in North Carolina. It was modeled off of the 2018 turnout model. The sample error is plus or minus 3.9%, and that's with a 95% confidence interval rating, meaning that if we did this poll 20 times, 19 times out of those 20, the results would fall within that 3.9% margin of error. All right, let's get going and let's talk about the electoral environment here in North Carolina. We wanted to know, how are people going to vote? Vote by mail was just a barrage in 2020. We didn't expect that sort of tidal wave of mail-in voting. I guess we could have anticipated it, but it was more, I think, than anybody really had ever seen or expected. So we asked people, these are all likely voters, remember, so how do you intend to vote? You can see 47.2% still intend to vote in person on Election Day, 7.7% absentee by mail, and 45.1% early in person. Who's going to vote on Election Day in person here? Who's going to vote by mail? Shame. No, I'm kidding. And who's going to vote in person before Election Day? That'll be me. I'll do that. All right. I was just curious. Dr. Taylor, any thoughts on this overview, generally speaking?
Well, it shows the institutionalization of new ways of voting, which I, of course, include early in-person voting as one of those, which is a fairly, as you all know, a fairly new development in North Carolina political history. So that's interesting. Significant proportion doing those two rather than in person on Election Day. One you'd think that this would be correlated with age, that older people would be, as traditionalists, would be more interested in voting in person on the day. But as you can see from, I can point to this, right? It's not going to.
Yeah, sure.
But you can see that there isn't really much of an effect with regards to age. It's partisanship. Mm-hmm. Republicans tend to vote in person on in person on Election Day. I also think this says a little bit about how people think about voting as well. I think culturally, people who vote in person on election day seem to think of voting as a kind of collective civic exercise, whereas I think people who don't tend to think of it more as a consumer. That really what counts is having your vote recorded. That's really what matters. So I think there's some kind of interesting cultural things going on there. But
it does. North Carolina has on election night sort of the Republican surge.
Yeah.
So what happens is early votes are counted, and those are the ones that are released to the public immediately. And everybody loses their minds on the conservative side because, oh my gosh, Democrats are up. But you'll see if you look at the partisan breakdown, all of our top lines and crosstabs are available on the John Locke website right now. Actually, if you want to go to johnlocke.org and click on polls or polling, you'll find it there. But you'll see 62% of Republicans are going to vote in person on election day, whereas something like 66% of Democrats are going to vote early in person, combined with another 13% absentee by mail. So all these Democrat votes are going to be counted early. The Republican votes will come in later, and unaffiliated voters are split. What is that? I think that's 45 to 46% between in-person on election day and in-person early. So the unaffiliated are going to break fairly evenly one way or the other. But what you're going to see is this initial surge of Democrat vote, and we'll continue to track this, but then you'll see this sort of constant Republican uptick.
It is interesting. This is fairly new as well, because when we first started doing in-person early voting in North Carolina, there wasn't the partisan division. What we tended to think was it was a function of activism,
right.
People caring about the election. The activists would vote early, and then people with less pronounced preferences would vote later. But now it does seem to be highly partisan.
It does. All right. Right direction, wrong track. We asked the question, generally speaking, would you say things in the United States are headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track? 64.8% say that it's off on the wrong track. 26.4% say it's in the right direction. 8.8% say they are unsure. This is still overwhelmingly, nearly two-thirds, not quite two-thirds, but nearly two-thirds are pessimistic about the direction of the country. However, this is better than it was in terms of optimism, pessimism from our June poll.
Yeah, I just looked at my notes because I was trying to remember the time series here. So it is, the wrong track is down.
It is.
From the July poll.
Right.
And I guess this goes a little bit in with the generic ballots as well, which are going to be the next questions. And on how there's been a bit of a Democratic bounce.
There has been.
The generic. So I think that's tied in with that inevitably.
There has been. And we'll go right into the next question. To that point, we do generic ballot tests because obviously this is a statewide poll, but North Carolina is broken up into congressional and legislative districts. And so we do generic ballot tests, the generic Republican versus the generic Democrat for the state legislature and for Congress. And so we ask the question, if the general election for state legislature was held today, would you vote for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate? You can see 47.9% said they would vote for the Republican, 42.9% say they would vote for the Democrat, 9.2% say they are undecided. This lead is 5% and is actually really good historically speaking for Republicans, but it is down, which means that we are seeing typical August to September tightening for an election. It was 11% in June, now it is 5%. Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, and I think, again, compared to the next one, which is the generic congressional ballot, the generic House race, Republicans have a larger lead in the state one than they do in the congressional one. But it's down, and I guess we can speculate a little bit about that. Maybe we'll speculate a little bit about that since all three questions have moved in the Democrats' favor a little bit in the last.
They have spoilers, but yeah.
Yeah.
Spoilers. Yeah. And we can move on that, but women have shifted a little bit. They are +4 for the Democrat, and they were +4 for the GOP in June. Unaffiliated voters have shifted a little bit. They do prefer Republicans still, but they've shifted by about 5%.
I guess one other thing to say, and I'll say this, I was more interested in this to a certain extent because of my focus of what I do in the congressional ballot, generic ballot. But it'd be interesting to see how many races this brings into play, right? So if we've had a movement, slight movement towards Democrats month over the month, what's the practical effect of that? Because obviously, as Don says, this is a generic ballot. If you're just asking about the R or the D candidate, we don't have the capacity to drill down in individual state legislative races. What kinds of how many seats does this actually make the how many seats does this actually make the Democrats more competitive in?
Right.
We don't have the capacity to know that.
No, we don't. But then the generic ballot test for Congress, regardless of how you would vote at the state level, if the general election for U.S. Congress was held today, would you vote for the Republican candidate or the Democrat candidate? 47.3% said they would vote for the Republican candidate. 44% said they would vote for the Democrat, with 8.7% undecided. Again, we see a shift here. The congressional ballot was R+1, now it's R+3. That's not quite right. That's
the other way around.
It was the other way around. It was +3, or no, it was +5. Sorry, I'm trying to remember. It was +5 and now it's +3. That's just a typo, and I'm sorry about that. But we're still seeing a shift on this. I think some people, when they see this poll, are going to view this as sort of a post-Dobbs tightening of the races, and that might be true. We don't have the capacity to know that just yet. I would say that the Dobbs decision and what happened with abortion probably has caused some people to change their minds, but we don't know that necessarily. I will say I still think some of this is typical about we're just getting closer to the election.
Well, you've got abortion questions, and we can talk. Right. Maybe we should hold off on that to abortion. Well, I'm going to hold off on talking about that until the abortion question. But it may be some tightening. Maybe the obviously economic, at least in terms of inflation indicators, have improved from historically very bad to historically just quite bad. That may be helpful for the Democrats. But again, back to the practical effect, right? So what does this mean? It's a bit easier to sort of think about this in terms of the congressional races because there's only 14 as opposed to 170 state legislative races. So what would this mean in practical terms? Well, it might be, there's two races where it could have an effect, I think. One, the obvious one would be the 13th. Which is really ceteris paribus, all the other things being equal, the only really toss-up seat.
Can you describe where the 13th is?
So the 13th is the southern part of Wake County. Wake County's now been split sort of in half. And then all of Johnston, is it all of Harnett? Maybe just half of Harnett and half of Wayne, I think. All of Joco, half of Harnett, half of Wayne, half of Wake, right? Right. This is Bo Hines, who's Republican candidate, and Wiley Nickel. So this is where the tightening can have an effect. And possibly in the first, which is obviously bad news for the Republican candidate if you've got tightening in the generic where Sandy Smith is Republican candidate against Don Davis. That's out in the eastern part of the state. Right. Yeah.
All right. All right, here's the one everybody wants to see, and it's the head-to-heads on the U.S. Senate race. The general election for U.S. Senate was held today, and you had to make a choice for whom would you vote. You see, this is a dead tie, 42.3% between Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley. We have Matthew Hoh of the Green Party, who is on the ballot, by the way, at 0.8%. Libertarian Shannon Bray at 1.9%, 12.6% undecided. Budd had been up by 5 points, and not traditionally, but in May and then in June, Budd had been polling behind the generic congressional candidate, the generic Republican congressional candidate at 47.3. You can see he's at 42.3. This sort of shows that trend that he's still polling behind the generic Republican. And two things have shifted in terms of the demographics. Budd did have a lead with seniors. He now does not after the June poll. And then he did have a lead in the Raleigh-Durham media market. He now does not have a lead in that media market.
So this is really interesting, and it's actually part of a trend against Republicans nationally in Senate races that we've seen over the summer. So, you would think in a midterm with a Democratic president that a 50-50 Senate was a shoo-in to go to the out party, which of course in this case is the Republicans. But it isn't anymore. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Republicans are defending a disproportionate number of seats. But it also has to do with the fact that some of the races where they really should be, places like Arizona and Pennsylvania, the bodily against a Republican candidate. And then in places where, they should be holding on and counting on maintaining the seat, like North Carolina, seem to be coming into question somewhat. We're seeing this a little bit, even in places like Florida and Ohio as well, where Marco Rubio in some polls is down. And J.D. Vance is still up, but Tim Ryan's closing the gap on him in Ohio. And all those three races are Republican seats. Obviously, Ohio, Rob Portman's retired, but and North Carolina, Richard Burr's retired. Obviously, Marco Rubio's incumbent.
From a practical standpoint, I'll say Sherry Beasley has definitely been on the air.
Yeah,
they've definitely been on the air over the summer.
And I think there's been a gamble by her campaign because obviously national parties have questions to ask themselves going into particularly midterm elections. You know, where do we want to spend our enormous yet still finite resources? And I think she's been trying to make a case that they should invest in North Carolina, and presumably by the Civitas poll data here, that's, at least for the time being, she's making a successful case.
Right. And I agree with all of that. I guess from I'm an unaffiliated voter and clearly a political spectator. But if I was a Republican activist, I can't help but I think I would be asking the question of, where's Club for Growth? You put an avalanche into the Republican primary and clearly altered the primary, right? Ted Budd had a very healthy primary, didn't spend very much of his own money. But is the qualitative difference between Ted Budd and Pat McCrory or Marjorie Eastman that much more important than the qualitative difference between Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley?
Yeah. It's a strategic decision, but everybody has finite resources. Everybody has experts who understand the rhythms and the ups and downs of campaigns and how you time these kinds of things.
Right.
Maybe they sort of left her for dead, and she's sort of demonstrating she isn't.
No, she's.
And that will, and that's a double-edged sword of this. Being in August, coming from behind and catching up with the leader in August.
Right.
Means that he's going to crack the whip harder on the horse, right?
Right.
And that.
Which is the other question. Can Budd survive this Beasley surge, and does Beasley have enough gas in the tank? And we don't know.
I think the second question's probably more pertinent. I mean, surely it would be a tremendously terrible year for Republicans and against historical precedent if Budd starts to really falter.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. All right, now we get to the North Carolina Supreme Court. We polled both Supreme Court races. If the general election for North Carolina Supreme Court was held today, you had to vote, who would you vote for? You can see Richard Dietz here is at 45.2% compared to Lucy Inman's 39.4%, 15.4% are undecided. It's always interesting on this race because this is a man running against a woman. You can see there is a little bit of a gender gap here. 52% of men are going to vote for Richard Dietz compared to 33% voting for Inman. You see 45% of women are going to vote for Inman as opposed to 40% for Dietz.
Yeah, although that's partisan to a large extent as well. I mean, but that is always interesting. But because we have partisan labels in judicial elections, we had an experiment in North Carolina where we didn't for a while. Now we do. And, generally, especially in judicial races, the R label is as valuable as it can ever be.
Right.
There are a whole host of reasons for this. Political scientists call it issue ownership. So obviously when we think of judges, we think of law and law enforcement and legal things. And that's generally an issue that Republicans, the generic Republican, will always run ahead of a generic Democrat on. Practical effects, I think you'll show the other Supreme Court race in a second. That's the next question. Practical effects are that if these bear out, and I'm previewing the answer to the next question, of course, then the partisan affiliation of the state Supreme Court majority will change from it currently being 4 Democrats on the 7-member Supreme Court to 4 Republicans.
That's right. But both seats that are currently held by Democrats.
Yes, sorry, I should have said.
And so, if you're a Republican, you want
an incumbent in the next one, and this is an open seat.
That's right. Yeah. But if you're a Republican and you want a Republican majority on the state Supreme Court, you have to bat 500.
Yes.
If you just bat 500, then you get a slim majority.
Yes, sorry, you do. Yes.
I was getting nervous for a second, Dr. Taylor. I thought I was wrong. Been explaining this wrong. This is the next race. It's Trey Allen versus Judge Sam Ervin, the fourth. 45.1% compared to 40.1%. Not much of a difference between those two. I pointed out the male-female gap in the last question. It's very similar, almost exactly from one question to the other. But when we first polled this race back in May, Inman had much more of a lead among females than she does now. And then it has quickly shifted in favor, or not quite in favor, but the damage has been mitigated, I guess. I don't know how to say that for both Republican candidates, but particularly with Richard Dietz. Anyway, anything you notice differentiating these two races?
Well, you did mention gender, which it just shows it's largely driven by partisanship across those two races. And so the distribution by gender is the same in the two races. No, again, this is interesting that the Republican candidates are running fairly healthily above the generic.
Right.
And of course, Bud, who, you know, in all of these polls on the R side is running the worst.
Right. We do know that unaffiliated voters are the largest block of voters in North Carolina now. Undecideds are at 14.8% overall in the state, but for unaffiliated voters, they're at 21% on undecided. So there's still a lot of votes in the air in this race.
It'd be interesting to the question wording does talk about Supreme Court, and I'm wondering if respondents maybe don't even hear the party, some respondents party label. They still don't believe or think that North Carolina has partisan judicial elections. They can't believe that North Carolina would do something so terrible.
That's just that's a strange question. Why would they ask?
Yeah, well, yeah. Why do they say Republican so and so and Democrat so and so?
Right.
These are judges.
Maybe that could very well be it, but we do. We do have partisan labels. All right. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that Joe Biden is doing as president? 38.7% say that they approve. 56.1% say that they disapprove. This is an improvement for President Biden, even though he's wildly underwater. What did you say? It went from very bad to quite bad?
Yeah, historically. Yeah, these are still pretty. I think nationally he's running a little bit ahead of what Trump was in 2018.
Okay.
Not much, but a little bit. And here he's worse off than he is nationally by about 2 or 3 percentage points, which makes sense given North Carolina's kind of political composition and how it fits into the country.
Sure. Unaffiliated voters are at 60% disapprove, which is even higher than this. So they're breaking towards disapproval more than what we're seeing statewide average for likely voters. Then we do approve or disapprove for the job that Roy Cooper is doing as governor. You can see he is slightly above water, but still within the margin of error. Remember, the margin of error is 3.9%. He's at 46.8% approve, 43.3% disapprove. Having watched this, I've been doing these Civitas polls. I'm in my 5th year now. He's like Teflon. He really is. It doesn't matter what's happening with Democrats nationally. He always polls better than what's going on with Democrats nationally. And even at the height of COVID, April or May of 2020, his approval rating was up around 72%. That was at the beginning of the shutdowns.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 interesting ways to look at this. One is that, you know, he's kind of, it's because he's our guy, as opposed to, you know, the sitting president who belongs to just about everybody else. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a sort of, you know, kind of a defensive mechanism when you're asked about your own governor, because if, you know, if your own governor's terrible, then it says something about you more personally than if your own president's terrible. Mm-hmm. But I think the second sort of Teflon Roy argument that you just made that holds some water. He does, and if you look at historically, if you look at Cooper approval ratings as well, they don't really take the kinds of shifts that if we took the Trump and Biden time series, they're a lot less volatile. Which I think is kind of interesting. There's a sort of baseline support that Cooper has, including presumably amongst some Republicans as well.
I think my personal opinion is some of this is, and anybody who's watched these polls has heard me say this before, I think we're all sort of victims of the infotainment news industry that, you turn on Fox News, you turn on CNN, bless you, or MSNBC, really bless you, whatever happens. And it's, even if nothing happened in Washington, D.C. that day, they're going to find something to be outraged about. Joe Biden used honey walnut cream cheese on his bagel today. What are the implications? Let's talk to our 3 talking heads about what that means in November. Like, stop it. While important things are actually happening at state capitals in Texas and North Carolina and Wisconsin and Florida, that gets no coverage. If only there was like a newspaper that would follow public policy and what's going on at the General Assembly. You should go to carolinajournal.com and get all that news, by the way.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. All right. How much trust do you have in the U.S. Congress? How's that going in here, by the way, guys? No? No hands. No hands. I even got a thumbs down. I don't even know how to score a thumbs down. But overall, you can see that the trust isn't great. 4.1%, a great deal. 23 or 21.3%, a fair amount. 43.4, not very much. 27.3, none at all. Overall, you can see there's a lot of orange, not very much blue here. Congress as an institution is losing trust. I don't think that's that much of a surprise.
No, not lose it. It hadn't had a lot for a long time.
Yeah.
And again, we can juxtapose this with the next 2 questions, which are also about institutions and trust in institutions. But Congress has never really liked or trusted, and those are 2 slightly different things, but by the American people. We tend to like our members, our House member, our senators, but we don't like the institution as a whole. Mm-hmm. Some of that, I think, has to do with the fact that it's kind of a messy institution. Mm-hmm. When we use metrics, personal metrics about institutional performance, we look for action, tangible results, accomplishments. Of course, Congress isn't really set up for that. And that's partly a function of the constitutional system. But it isn't often able to say, look what we've done, look at the tangible outcomes. Right. Which is different from the other 2 institutions that you're going to show us.
Yeah, I think Congress and public schools sort of poll similarly, or in the same way. I didn't poll public schools, so that's not a spoiler. But in that, the public school in my neighborhood is great. Public schools generally are terrible.
Well, if you look at historically, public schools tend to be viewed much more positively than Congress.
Right.
As an institution.
Well, I mean, fair enough. But generally speaking, people like theirs, the one in their neighborhood,
yes,
the one that belongs to them more than the institution as a whole.
I'm sure that's probably true. Yeah. Yeah.
Now that I muddied that up. How about the Supreme Court? How much trust do you have in the Supreme Court? A bit more confidence here in the Supreme Court. Overall, the Supreme Court's underwater in terms of trust here. This does go unsurprisingly here on partisan grounds. You can see Republicans, Democrats nearly mirrors of each other. If you look specifically at a fair amount and not very much in the middle. But yeah, overall, I think this probably waxes and wanes some, but particularly in a post-Dobbs world, you can see there's a lot.
Well, we forgot to mention the partisan nature of support for Congress as well. And so this isn't surprising. We have Democratic majorities in both chambers of Congress, and so Democrats, more so than Republicans, have trust in Congress at the moment. We think about the Supreme Court, and obviously it's not an explicitly partisan institution, but given media commentary about what the Supreme Court's doing, given the partisanship of presidents who nominated the current 9 justices, we think about it as more of a sort of R or a conservative institution. And so as a result, right, the Supreme Court is most trusted by Republican voters. So there's sort of rooting for the home team going on here.
Right. The 3 highest groups that voted a great deal of confidence or trust in the Supreme Court are Republican voters at 25%, conservative, self-described conservatives at 26%, and Trump 2020 voters at 27%. I don't think there's any surprise there. And if you want to go to none at all, it's very similar. Democrats at 39%.
And this isn't necessarily. This has been happening prior to Dobbs' decision. I think the real key historical moment in this is the Bush versus Gore decision in 2000. where everybody used to love the Supreme Court, regardless of partisanship, regardless of what the court did. Even through the 60s, interestingly enough, when the court was much more left-wing than it is now. But there was something about that decision, and if you look at a time series of partisan trust in the Supreme Court, a lot of liberals and Democrats sort of started bailing after that.
And then we asked about the FBI. Timely. How much trust do you have in the FBI? Again, there's some partisanness to this.
Sure.
54% of Republicans say none at all. Democrats are very heavily on a great deal or a fair amount, but I say this one's probably the most divided of the three that we did.
Again, law enforcement agency. I mean, if you look at, if you said your local sheriff's department, your local police force, or city police department, you have them flipped.
Right.
Just shows how much partisan politics has penetrated into areas that, prior to the last couple of decades, it wouldn't have. Regardless of the search of Mar-a-Lago, I suspect, if it had been a search of, I don't know, Bush, H.W. Bush's, of Kennebunkport.
Right.
And it's hard to imagine this, but if it had been, I suspect it wouldn't have moved the needle at all. The Democrats would have been less trusting than Republicans because of the nature of the FBI and what it does. But now it's all wrapped up in partisan politics.
Right. All right, let's talk about the recession real quick. Everybody's favorite topic. Do you agree or disagree that we're currently in an economic recession? 66% of likely voters in North Carolina agree that we are in a recession. 19.5% say that, or that they disagree. 10.9% say neither. Don't know what that means, and 3.4% are unsure. There's not much partisanness to this. 66% is, that's an overwhelming number, and if it was an election, that's a landslide. And so generally speaking, even a plurality of Democrats are saying we're in a recession. A plurality of liberals, self-described liberals, are saying we're in a recession. Of course, Republicans and conservatives are jumping on it because it's not only is it just true, but it's also politically opportune. And
then it's really interesting compared to the next question.
It is. How worried are you about losing your job in the next 12 months? 66.8% say not very worried. 24.9% say that they are worried.
So you would think if you thought we were in a recession, many more people would be personally worried that that their job security is under threat. So this is an interesting question. And it's not specific to North Carolina, I'm sure, but I think people have thought about, they're looking at inflation, obviously, and historic increase in prices that we've seen, dramatic and very quick, unprecedented since the late 1970s, early 1980s, and they're saying, oh, the economy's terrible, we're in a recession. So I think what people are sort of kind of thinking recession equals bad economy, rather than using the sort of technical economic term for the meaning of a recession, which is National Bureau of Economic Research says 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth or a reduction in the size of the economy. They just see recession, they say bad, but it's not. This isn't about my job. This is about prices.
Right.
That's what's going on.
Right. And our last poll did indicate that people thought that the prices of goods and services were the leading economic indicator of whether or not we were in a recession. It's not necessarily true, but that's what voters had in their minds. All right, let's talk about abortion. Not a topic we typically cover here at the John Locke Foundation, but you can't do a political poll in North Carolina and not talk about this topic at this point, and so we did. When thinking about the issue of abortion, would you consider yourself pro-life or pro-choice? 39%, 39.0% exactly, said that they are pro-life. 48.0% say that they are pro-choice. 9.8% refuse to be labeled. That's a whole other issue. And 3.2% are unsure.
So the darker bars are those who are strongly
pro-life.
So as opposed
or strongly pro-choice.
Right. So what is interesting in this question, so when you just use the label, people are pretty hardcore and it's polarized, obviously, in one camp or the other. And this makes the issue seem incredibly polarizing. But there are other questions which I think are kind of interesting.
There are.
So
we've asked this question before, and there's three similar results. When do you think abortion should be legal? And the four choices in the dark blue are abortion should always be legal, and there should be no restrictions. The Carolina blue there is abortion should be legal, but with some restrictions, such as for minors or late-term abortions. The medium orange there is abortion should be illegal except in special circumstances, such as when the life of the mother is in danger or in cases of incest or rape. And then the dark orange is abortion should be illegal and it should never be allowed under any circumstances. I think the point you were driving at is that the majority of people are here, that this all or nothing between it should always be legal or it should always be illegal. The bulk of the voters are somewhere in between there.
Right. Yes. So once you ask a question in a more nuanced way, and it's a minority of people are at the polls, which is completely legal or completely illegal. The majority of people, I think, I'll think about it and say, well, I don't want to live in a world where it's a one end or the other. When should it be allowed? When should it not be allowed? So this is being pointed out, as Donald said, by the greater size in the lighter colored bars in both of those questions. Now, you guys, the pollster didn't break down the crosstabs. Been really interesting to see where the pro-life, pro-choice people were on this, or the hardcore, right? The strongly pro-choice and strongly pro-life people. And there's presumably a lot of strongly pro-life people, for example, who are in this orange 34.9% bar.
I didn't look that up. You actually can look that up in the crosstabs. You just have to go pretty deep in them.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't obviously go deep enough.
I can get them for you, but you can if you want to download the crosstabs on our website, again, at johnlocke.org. Click on polls. This poll will be the first one up there. You can download the crosstabs yourself and find that answer. That would be really interesting, and I'll look that up and I'll send it to you. All right. On August 3rd, President Joe Biden signed an executive order directing the Department of Health and Human Services to consider using Medicaid to pay for expenses for those who cross state lines to seek abortions. Do you approve or disapprove of this executive order? You can see 40.4% approve, 50.3%, that's actually higher than I thought it was going to be, disapprove, 6.6% say neither, 2.7% are unsure. Wanted to ask this question because North Carolina is actively debating whether or not to expand Medicaid. And I was trying to figure out, well, how are Republican voters who are being courted by Republicans running for state legislature on Medicaid expansion, how are they going to react to this question? And you can see Republicans, 84% disapprove of this policy.
Yeah, but I think it's the abortion thing that's flashing rather than the Medicaid thing. I think what people are saying is, I may be, I'm sure there are not any strong pro-choice people in there, but there may be some weak pro-choice people, weak pro-life people in there who say, there's some give on abortion here, but I don't want to spend it. I don't want to pay for it. Right. I think that's what. That's fair enough.
Fair enough. Next question. Didn't know that there was going to. Yeah. Didn't know that this was going to be changed last night. Right. In case you didn't know, there was a federal court ruling last night that lifted the injunction on North Carolina's 20-week ban on abortions. Which makes this poll incredibly timely with this question. As you may know, the United States Supreme Court recently made a ruling overturning the Roe v. Wade case from 1972, which established a woman's right to an abortion. Due to this ruling, North Carolina's General Assembly has asked a federal judge to reinstate the state's ban on abortions after 20 weeks, a law that passed in 1973. Would you approve or disapprove of the court reinstating the 20-week ban on abortion in North Carolina? My squares are off. I don't know what happened there. But 44% said they would approve, 42.6% say they would disapprove, 7% say neither, 6.4% say unsure.
So this is slightly different from the pro-choice, pro-life, but again, because of the complication of the question, right? It's a 20-week, right? It's still, it's not a complete ban.
Right.
It's also something that's already been on the books. It's status quo law, really. It's only a federal judge's decision that suspended it.
Right.
It's more palatable. And so you see that side go up.
Yeah.
What we would consider the pro-life side.
I actually thought that the approval would be a little higher since we see so many people in the middle here. That's what I thought, but clearly I'm not in the mind of every voter. Although I try to be. All right. The North Carolina State Employee Health Plan, this is not to do with abortion, it's a little different, but it's an issue that has continued to come up, so we decided to poll it. The North Carolina State Employee Health Plan will resume coverage for treatments leading to or in connection with sex changes or modifications complying with a recent federal court ruling that declared the refusal of coverage unconstitutional. Do you approve or disapprove of the state employee health plan covering sex changes or modification treatments? I struggled with the wording of this question for obvious reasons for a long time, but I pulled sex changes or modification treatments from the court case, so I figured it was safe to use so everybody would understand. But you can see 55% disapprove, 29.9% approve, 9.5% neither, 5.4% unsure.
Again, I think because it's a state health plan rather than someone owned private insurance,
Right.
I think that makes a big difference in the way people respond, which again is because taxpayers obviously pay or subsidize, at least greatly subsidize the state healthcare plan. State employees also pay to it, but taxpayers greatly subsidize it. Then they're saying, you know, I don't really. There's a lot of people in there in the disapproval probably saying, I don't care what you do, but I don't want to pay for it, right? I'm sure there's a lot of that.
Yeah, there's probably a good bit of that. The 29 point of the approval.
There really isn't a great deal apart from partisanship and ideology.
Yeah, I mean 75%.
If you take, well, it's skewed towards the young, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And that's to the extent that the partisanship and ideology aren't explained all of. There's youth there, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, 52% of 18 to 34-year-olds. 75% of liberals say that. 56% of Democrats approved. Urban and suburban voters are actually over the 29%. So it's spread out a bit, but
the age is striking.
It is. It is. That is.
In addition to partisanship and ideology.
That is very striking because it immediately goes down to 31%, 19%, and 29%.
A majority of 18 to 34-year-olds are in approval.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about energy. How concerned are you about energy and gas prices in North Carolina? That's a big number. That's a very large number. 87.7%. A clear majority are very concerned at 63.2% compared to 11.2% saying they're not concerned. 1.1%, within the margin of error are unsure. This isn't partisan in nature, really. Everybody's generally concerned about the price of energy.
Yeah. In Europe, it would be 97.7 the moment. But yeah, it would be interesting to see a time series as well, right? We've seen a meaningful. We're on the cheaper side in North Carolina in terms of gasoline prices at the pump, but there's been some. I know I have friends in California who are celebrating that it's not $7 a gallon anymore. But it would be interesting to see if we had a time series, right? Whether this will come down.
And keep tracking this. It would be interesting. Would you approve or disapprove of a federal law that would dramatically increase oil and gas drilling in the United States? That number surprises me too. 60.3% they would approve, 28.3% say they would disapprove, 7.3% neither, 4.1% unsure. Obviously, there's some ideological play here. 67% of liberals disapprove compared to 80% of self-described conservatives that would approve, but generally speaking, I mean, that 60% is still a really large number.
Here's the interesting number. Notice that coastal, I mean, I don't know how many, so we got 655 voters, so once you get into some of these categories, the degrees of freedom going down and the proportion of subjects is small, but you would think there would be a regional effect and that coastal voters would be the least likely, right? Because presumably a lot of this is going to be offshore and their beautiful views from their huge verandas of the ocean are going to be spoiled. Right. But they actually are more in favor of it.
Yeah, that when we have these areas, these are television markets. So Charlotte, they group Western North Carolina, so the Asheville, Spartanburg television market in with Charlotte. Then you have Central, and that's Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Raleigh-Durham TV market. And then the coastal there, that's Wilmington and the New Bern, Greenville television market. And that 67% is striking, to your point. And that's an increasingly red area. I think people overall are surprised, North Carolina's urban areas are turning more blue. How is North Carolina still as purple as it is? And what's the group at the University of Virginia? Larry Sabato's group. I can't. Crystal ball people.
Yeah.
They had an interesting article about a year and a half ago about a good bit of the reason that that's true in North Carolina is because the coast is turning redder over time, as opposed to the urban areas.
Yeah. Well, the northeast coast has always been fairly red, largely a function of affluence.
Yeah.
But the southeast is becoming increasingly red, and that's more sort of cultural, I think.
And then you have people like Amy Cook moving to Carteret County. Oh, she's left. I can't make fun of her. Oh, it's devastating. All right. Which one of these statements about energy production and the environment do you most agree? North Carolina lawmakers should prioritize the environment even at the risk of increasing the cost of electricity. That's 37.4%. Or North Carolina lawmakers should prioritize affordability and reliability in energy even at the risk of not meeting certain carbon emissions goals at 45%. 17.1% are unsure.
Yeah, the one thing that hit me about this, a lot of the big polls ask these trade-off questions quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And there has been, obviously there's ideological and partisan elements, but there have been sort of socioeconomic ones as well. Mm-hmm. So less affluent voters and African-American voters tend to be more sort of embracing of jobs when they're traded off against the environment. But don't really see it so much here. We don't have the, we do have the income.
Yeah, we do have the income.
But it actually, yeah, it's a wash. It's less clear than it tends to be in those national questions.
Yeah, what did stick out to me here is that the 3 and 4 and 4 voters, those are high propensity voters. They vote in 3 of every 4 elections or 4 out of 4 of every elections. There is a gap leaning towards the prioritize affordability and reliability of 12% for these high propensity voters, the voters that are going to vote in midterms, to be just candid with you, as opposed to the 1 and 2 of 4 voters are about even at 43 and 41%. All right, it's time for question and answer. Any questions in the audience? John Hood.
Y'all were talking about that 20-week abortion ban question. I went back to look at the wording of the question in the poll, and my hypothesis would be something like this. The question specifically talks about a ban, 20-week ban. We all think that the focus of a poll response will be 20 weeks. It's more likely, in my mind, it'll be a year ban.
Ban, yeah.
So if, for example, you asked, North Carolina law currently allows abortions for the first 20 weeks of pregnancy and forbids them after that point. The federal judge had previously blocked that law, but now it's going to, would you want, in other words, if you emphasize allowed for 20 weeks, you'd probably get a higher support for policy than if you emphasize ban after.
Yeah.
It's the same policy, this is all linguistic.
Sure.
Well, and also if people, and if people think about what 20 weeks is, as opposed to under Roe, it's the first trimester, which is what, 14, 13 weeks. So the difference isn't huge in many ways. It's still in some ways, particularly given what's going on in a number of states around the country, this is not conservative or pro-life or whatever, whichever label you want to give to, a particularly radical thing, right? So if you think about it in those terms, I think you'd get some more people saying. But I think you're right, John, the word ban is incredibly prominent there, as opposed to, and having to think about what 20 weeks, what does 20 weeks mean, right? I had to think about it. Well, so 9 months is what? 40 weeks, right? It took me a while to think about that. And then 20 weeks is halfway. Well, it's already only under Roe 14, so they don't think that in those terms. They think in terms of the ban.
Yes, sir.
Ban reminds people of the Taliban.
Yeah. Well, people don't like being banned for anything, right?
Yeah, if you phrase your question as where should the protection for the unborn be, or limitations, you get a much higher approval than using the term that's used by the abortionist.
Sure.
Yeah, and this goes to question wording, and so then that becomes a problem as to what are people's true preferences, right? And the costs of answering a question are very low, so you don't want to, if they load the question, you don't want to feel shame in front of the well, it's now the computer as much as anything else, but it used to be a real live human being, but you're just pushed into a particular category. What you're really showing there is that the person's fairly unsure rather than really being able to glean out how they feel. I think one of the interesting things about the Dobbs decision in the way people have responded to it has to do with Americans' innate conservatism, and I mean that in a traditional sense rather than in the way we use it kind of in ideological terms. And that is, in many ways, the Roe decision was kind of an institution. I mean, it's 50 years old nearly. For a long time, it wasn't on the radar screen. Obviously, for a lot of people in the country it was, but I think for the average American it was sort of settled. And there are some people who I think who are sort of pro-choicey, pro-lifey, who are kind of don't think it was a good idea. They think it was just, it's something that's already been done, it's settled. It's sort of a part of the American furniture now, and I don't like change, and this is radical. This is very big, and I'm not sure whether it's a good idea or not. I think there's something to that is making this so-called Dobbs reaction a little bit more than just about, pro-choice and pro-life forces going at it.
Yes, ma'am.
I think there's an element of the issue that is completely left out of the conversation publicly, and that is that the people who are pro-life and all of the crisis pregnancy centers are actually showing more love towards the mother and understanding her predicament, understanding her emotions and how an abortion is going to have a really negative impact on her. And Planned Parenthood centers don't care about how the abortion is going to have an emotional and physical and psychological impact on the mom. And that difference is not being promoted.
That might be something that respondents to survey questions aren't thinking. But I will say, if you look at what we were going through, the vast majority of people are really, really cut up about it, right? It is an issue that, for the vast majority of Americans, will not affect them personally directly. And you can say it's about, the vast majority of women aren't thinking of being pregnant or cannot be pregnant at one point in time, right? My daughter is big on the issue. She's 16, right? But she's, she will presumably at some stage, or at least contemplate the issue. But men and a large portion of the female population, it's not. But people think about it very seriously, as you have, in different ways, right? It pulls them apart, and that's what I think that question's getting at. People want nuance. It's a moral, highly important question, even if it's for many people personally kind of hypothetical and abstract, and they beat themselves up about it. And I think you see that a lot in that responses, where once you get away from the simplistic labels and you give people 4 or 5 policy options, they move away from the extremes and they want something else.
Yes, ma'am.
I think I heard you say you're registered unaffiliated.
Mm-hmm.
Would you explain that and then comment on the increase in unaffiliated voting?
Sure. Why I registered unaffiliated? So, yeah, my family are Republicans. Republicans got the Christmas cards from the Bush family for years, et cetera, et cetera. You laugh, but it happened. I changed my registration twice when I moved to North Carolina back in 2007. First, I changed, I'll tell you my history. So I changed to Libertarian because I had it in my head that, I just didn't trust government, generally speaking. Then I changed back to Republican, and that was about the time the Obamacare debate came back in. And I changed actually on this issue specifically because part of the talks that were going in the Michael Steele-run RNC at the time is that they wanted to come out with their own version of Obamacare, and they were actively debating within the RNC whether or not to have a provision for publicly funded abortions. And I'm like, well, I'm done. I'm more conservative on this issue than the Republican Party now, and I have gone unaffiliated. because I don't feel like the Republican Party is in the business of getting Republicans elected, and Democrats are in the business of getting Democrats elected, and I actually care about how public policy affects people. That's why I work at the John Locke Foundation. And so that's how I did it. I think that you still have a lot of partisan, there's a lot of partisan people within unaffiliated voters. They're clearly breaking more towards Republicans than Democrats. That's just true as the unaffiliated bloc has grown. In North Carolina, Republicans continue to win the majority of congressional seats and the majority of seats at the state legislature. But that's why I did it.
It's a practical matter. It doesn't. I mean, if you know, I think that a lot of people put more stock in party registration than the average person does. Particularly in a state like North Carolina, where as an unaffiliated voter, you can choose which primary to vote in. And
Right.
I think there are a lot of
Republican,
strategic unaffiliated voters as well who maybe generally vote for R's or D's in general elections, but they do it because maybe it's transparent now, which is interesting, right? That may be explaining a lot of unaffiliated. Like you can research people now, and people seem to be more driven to Google around and find out about people they don't like or they do like, and so you're showing it now in a way you didn't in the past because it's easily searchable. Also, of course, as I said, it allows you to vote in primaries. So we did see, for example, in 2008, a fairly sizable number of Republicans who, and I can't remember the figures, who re-registered unaffiliated because they wanted to vote in the Democratic presidential primary in 2008. If you remember, it was a highly contested, even coming at the late stage that we have our primary in May. So, I think party registration to a large extent people think it conveys much more information about an individual than it really does. And we know that for a fact. Going back, there were an awful lot of registered Democrats in North Carolina who religiously voted for Republican candidates because how could Republican candidates have won elections in North Carolina if they didn't do that? Right. But it is interesting that people do seem to think it's critically important. I know it's important for candidates because they have to be registered, but beyond that, it really isn't very important as compared to do you vote often and who do you vote for, which of course we can't research because we rely on people's word to find out.
I think, and maybe you can clarify this, but my thoughts on the growth of the unaffiliated voter is because they're disappointed in both parties from a perspective of policy. But also it's a tool to use against one party versus the other. It's a way to water down a candidacy, a primary, and that to me is problematic because it's not really giving us a clear picture of the best candidates because we're getting watered down.
Well, we should have it different then. We should have it European style. Why don't we have dues-paying members? Oh. So if you want to vote in a Republican primary or a Democratic primary, you have to pay $100 a year. Okay, but what I'm saying is that would be more consistent with what you're saying rather. It's because it's like I just talked about 2008. That's strategic, and we have same-day registration. We do have same-day registration. So you could change. Right. In person on day you cannot. Right. Early voting you can. So
I think you hit on it. And the trend is it's cooler to be unaffiliated.
Yeah.
Well,
when it comes up in conversation.
I agree. But there are a lot of people who do not want to get put into a partisan.
So we are right. We are right at.
We're off topic, aren't we?
I don't care. We're talking about whatever. But I don't want to keep anybody longer than we said. But I'm going to take one more question from the back.
I see party registration as a form of expression, speech, and if the person goes unaffiliated, it kind of says I'm sick of both parties.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But it's forced expression because it's transparent now. I mean, that again, you look up voter registration lookup, you can see how people are. You can also see what primary they vote in, by the way, as well. So unaffiliated, you can see whether they took the R or the D ballot in primaries, and I guess you can make inferences from that if you really want to.
All right.
Can I just ask one overall question for you? You had 5% pretty much across the board was the movement. Does that reflect that who you polled? In other words, you had 5% maybe more liberal.
5% on what?
And statistically, I mean, every race you said, okay.
Oh, on the
well,
races?
Bud was here and now
No,
he's
so
5% this race.
So this is a likely voter poll, and so the proportions of men, women, Democrats, ages, and all that are modeled off of what we think will be the likely turnout. So those proportions haven't changed. Those people's opinions, or those types of people's.
But it's not a panel. It's not a panel. So it's not the same voters. So they're not taking the same people and asking them every month. But it is high quality sample. And so it is a movement. I think what you're saying is we're kind of seeing a movement generally in the D direction a little bit.
Rather than just polling 5% more liberal and you're at the same.
That's right. That's right.
That's a different group than what you poll in June.
Yeah, but off of the same proportional model of what the demographics are.
Yeah.
Happy to answer those questions, and we'll stay around after to talk. But thank you all for tuning in online. Thank you all for coming in person to the poll lunch. We'll send out information very soon about the September poll lunch and the October poll lunch, and we're just always happy to have people back in person at the John Locke Foundation.
Amen.
Thank you very much.